2 weeks ahead of Iraq's money. The central bank is very embarrassed behind the scenes in Baghdad. Quick follow-up from Ziad al-Hashami. Private banks have less than 2 weeks left to implement the reform plan, drawn up by the American company Oliver Wyman, before the Iraqi banking system is forced to liquidate violators. This leaves the central bank with only 2 options: either increasing the bank's capital and merging those unable to increase the size of their financial portfolios, or liquidation, which would lead to the direct intervention of the US Federal Reserve to implement international banking standards. This would be a scenario resembling US guardianship over Iraqi banks, something Baghdad wants to avoid in order to preserve its reputation and independence. However, economic expert Ziad al-Hashami hints at the presence of beneficiary parties who are opposing the proposed reform plan and obstructing its implementation behind the scenes, without taking into account the major repercussions of the return of direct US intervention. The Central Bank of Iraq, CBI, has a last chance to reform its banking system by implementing the reform plan and imposing its will on those obstructing it. Otherwise, the Treasury and the Federal Reserve will be on the lookout. Over the past years, the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury have pursued a strict, direct policy with the CBI, which has forced nearly 50% of banks out of operation or dealing in dollars as a result of sanctions and deprivation. During that period, the Federal Reserve imposed numerous conditions and requirements on the CBI to increase compliance, the most important of which were expanding the scope of direct transfers and electronic payments, streamlining the number of banks by liquidating some and merging others, and changing the ownership structure and capitalization of banks. This situation has placed the CBI in a very embarrassing situation between the hammer of the Federal Reserve and the anvil of the powerful parties in Iraq that own and operate dozens of banks and live off the movement of the dollar and the revenues of these banks, as a compromise to spare the CBI the embarrassment and pressure it is facing. An American company, OW, which has joint work relationships with the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury, was commissioned to evaluate the Iraqi banking system and present a reform action plan for this system. The firm presented a banking reform plan, which included requirements based on and consistent with those demanded by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury over the past year. In other words, the Central Bank of Iraq, CBI, received the same US federal requirements, but indirectly through an American company, in what appears to be a tactic to cover up direct federal intervention in reforming the Iraqi banking system. The plan is now ready for implementation after the CBI announced it. This is a double-edged sword. The United States can, if it wants, use this money as a political bargaining chip. Iraq is here between financial stability and the loss of some of its economic sovereignty. On the other side of the river, in Baghdad, Mirza Mohammed Saleh, the Prime Minister's economic advisor, defends keeping the funds at the Federal Reserve as a legal safety net that allows for diversification of reserves and depositing a portion of them in other central banks, protected by law. He told the agency, the United States does not control oil revenues themselves, but it does control the movement of the dollar, a reality imposed by the US currency's position in the global financial system. Money under the microscope. According to leaks obtained by Shafak news agency, from a senior source in the central bank, the balances deposited in the Federal Reserve range between $80 and $85 billion. These funds are used to finance foreign trade, pay the state's obligations, control the dinar exchange rate, and curb inflation. However, after discovering routes for smuggling dollars to Iran and other sanctioned countries, the US Treasury Department tightened controls and imposed sanctions on 35 of Iraq's 72 banks, including the Bank of Baghdad, which holds accounts for US embassy staff. These restrictions have reduced the flow of dollars into the local market, driving up the exchange rate and increasing the cost of imports, weighing heavily on commercial activity and citizens' livelihoods. Old debt risks. In international markets, these reserves are viewed as a key guarantee for meeting international payments and a safety valve against oil price fluctuations. Any indication of a change in the deposit mechanism or a relaxation of US Oversight could raise Iraq's borrowing costs, impact its credit rating, and potentially put the dinar under additional pressure. In this vein, economic expert Nabil al-Tamimi warns that excessive reliance on the US umbrella conceals a greater risk, noting that there are debts and claims that have not been settled since 2003, making assets vulnerable to seizure if they are removed from the Fed's protection. Negligence in closing debt files has left legal loopholes that can be exploited. He adds that part of these risks are due to defects in government performance after 2003 and the lack of serious follow-up on these commitments. In contrast, Mahmoud Daga, a former banking official, believes that withdrawing funds from the Federal Reserve would be a strategic mistake, noting that the international immunity enjoyed by the Federal Reserve protects Iraq from any claims, given the existence of unresolved international financial cases against the Ministry of Finance. Iraq relies on oil to finance more than 90% of its budget, making the timely arrival of revenues extremely critical. Any delay, whether for political or technical reasons, could lead to a crisis of confidence locally and internationally. The dollar faces global pressure and a potential decline of up to 35%. Newspaper analysis. Economist Zaki al-Sadi asserted that the US dollar is going through a critical phase globally, even domestically. He pointed out that US President Donald Trump's recent policies, including the imposition of new taxes on China and the introduction of value-added tax, VAT, have negatively impacted the US currency. Al-Sadi explained in an interview with Jarida, platform that talk about the expansion of the BRICS bloc and the accession of new countries, in addition to the complex geopolitical situation, especially the US-Israeli war on Iran, are all factors that put pressure on the dollar and weaken its global standing, with economists predicting a decline in its value of between 8% and 35%. He pointed out that the Iraqi market is also experiencing a state of confusion due to these repercussions, as any return to military escalation could lead to the targeting of some banks or the imposition of sanctions, which would limit dollar transactions and push investors to consider alternatives such as real estate or commercial assets. Al-Sadi explained that the central bank's suspension of dollar sales via platforms at the official rate has contributed to a decline in demand for the currency locally, coupled with citizens' fears of a change in its value or the emergence of an alternative currency. He added, any temporary rise in the value of the dollar could occur if war breaks out again, but its impact will be temporary. Iraq's link to the dollar remains strong, as imports and state salaries are settled in this currency, meaning any fluctuation in its price will have a direct and clear impact on citizens. Iraq faces US banking guardianship. 2 crucial weeks for private banks. Al-Mustaqilla, less than 2 weeks remain for private banks in Iraq to comply with the financial reform roadmap developed by the American firm Oliver Wyman, a move described by economic circles as the last chance to save the banking system from the specter of liquidation and bankruptcy. According to informed banking sources, the Central Bank of Iraq has 2 options: forcing banks to increase their capital and merge those unable to expand their financial portfolios, liquidating violating banks, which opens the door wide to direct intervention by the US Federal Reserve to implement international standards in the Iraqi banking sector, the risk of liquidation and financial guardianship. The second scenario is viewed with great concern within Baghdad, as it effectively imposes a form of American tutelage over the Iraqi banking sector, a precedent that could threaten Baghdad's financial independence and undermine public confidence in the banking system as a whole. Experts believe that the US Federal Reserve's involvement could completely redraw the banking landscape in Iraq, from foreign exchange mechanisms to banks' ability to finance local projects.